so much of the political machinery and the political power has been controlled by very conservative politicians that don't always ask about the best interest of those communities
Mhm.
we've been talking about. And so part of the organizing that has taken place has been organizing around political representation. Thanks for the invitation to be on the podcast. My name is Juan de Lara. I am an associate professor at the University of Southern California in the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity. And I'm also the director for the Latinx and Latin American Studies Center. Um, I'm working on a lot of different projects, but I'll just talk about a couple that I think are relevant to the conversation today. I wrote a book in 2018 that's called Inland Shift, Race, Space, and Capital in Inland Southern California that looked at, how did the Inland Empire become this kind of focal point for the global logistics economy? I was looking around. I went to college, the Claremont colleges in the early 1990s. And when I was there, I talked to a lot of community members. We were working on community environmental issues, community development issues in Riverside, Ontario, and all of those areas. And what we found is a lot of communities, especially in places like Miraloma, in places like Chino, places like Ontario, were dealing with the expansion of the warehouse industry in those areas. And so we were kind of curious about why is it? Why is it that all of a sudden we start to see the expansion of warehouses in the early 1990s in the Inland Empire? And so after I finished my college degree at the Claremont colleges, I did some work working on um, uh, labor justice issues, environmental justice issues, and then decided to go back to school where I went to UC Berkeley to get my PhD. And part of the PhD program means picking a topic that you want to write on for your dissertation. And I kind of had an idea about what I wanted to do, and then figured out and realized that I should really go back to that question. Why is it that the Inland Empire became such an important hub for the global logistics industry? And really thinking about the role of the Inland Empire in global capitalism, right? And so I started writing, and it took me a while to do, as dissertations take. But I wrote about just why the region became such an important part of the global logistics um, industry, and realized that a lot of it had to do with the expansion of the port of LA. And the way that local politicians and business leaders invested billions of dollars in expanding the capacity of the port. And they did so because the United States was essentially at that time going through this period of globalization, where there were a lot of factories and manufacturing plants that were being shut down, and people were losing their jobs. And so local political leaders, you know, thought about it and tried to figure out how to replace all of the jobs that were being lost during the manufacturing decline in the post 1980s and 90s period. And there was a decision that was made to invest in the ports because we were going through a phase where the United States used to be the center of manufacturing and production, and that was being flipped on its head. So we went from being the exporter of manufactured goods to a major importer of manufactured goods. And it so happened that a lot of the imports that were coming in, that we were going to the stores to buy cars, refrigerators, any little thing that you would go to Walmart or Kmart or Target to buy, was now being made in other countries, and especially in Asian countries. And because California is closer to Asia, these politicians and business leaders realized that there was a role to play, that with the expansion of global manufacturing and production in Asia, that those products were going to have to come back to the United States, because we were still, even if we weren't producing goods, we were still consuming a large share of the goods that were being produced in the world economy. And so the decision was made, well, instead of being a manufacturing hub, let's be an import hub. And we can then, all those jobs that used to be in the manufacturing center can now be replaced by warehouse jobs, port jobs, truck driving jobs, delivery jobs, etc. And so the rationale was that these politicians and policymakers and regional planners and business interests pursued that. And they invested a lot of money on infrastructure, on expanding the ability of the port to grow, to become the West Coast and the biggest port in the country. Because LA wasn't always the biggest port in the country, but it became the biggest port in the country precisely because of these two things: the changing economy of the globalization period, but also the massive investment in infrastructure and especially the ports. Now, here's the problem. The problem is that you can expand the ports all you want, but the planners also knew that in order to absorb all of the goods that they wanted to bring in through the ports of LA and Long Beach, that they had to have major space to absorb them, to put them into warehouses. And if you look at the documentation and the planning documents in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, what you see is that they knew very well that they couldn't build all of those warehouses in Orange County and LA County. They knew that if they were going to be able to expand the port and to make it into the largest port in the country, if they were going to be able to invest in the ports, that they needed to also invest in expanding the capacity to build warehouses in places like Riverside and San Bernardino counties. And in fact, they determined that about half of all of the new supply of warehouse space was going to have to be built in Riverside and San Bernardino County. And so part of the investment that was made wasn't just about expanding the ports and around the ports, but it was also about expanding all of the roads, all of the overpasses, and the railways that were then able to feed all of the stuff that was coming in through ships from places like Taiwan, China, Malaysia, Japan. All of that stuff was coming in on boats, unloaded at the port of Long Beach in LA, and then usually through trucks and semi trucks, then driven out to the Inland Empire to be sorted and rearranged, and before it was sent out to the consumer, or before it was sent out to stores, or before it was sent out to other places in California or in the American West. And so, in a long, way to answer your question, that's kind of what got me interested in this issue. And so I wrote that book, and then that was published. A lot of people, then all of a sudden we had major issues around our supply chain. Everybody became interested in this, and where we're at now is then dealing with now what is the next phase of this, right? And so I'm currently working on another book that looks at the conversion of military bases into logistics hubs. And that was also part of that process, right? And so I'm looking at places like the Norton Air Force Base, and thinking about, what does it mean for the Norton Air Force Base that is now the San Bernardino Airport, International Airport? Like, how can we explain this transformation? And the fact that Amazon has now made it into its Western regional hub. And there are a lot of questions there, right? Because essentially the way that I approach it and the way that I'm writing about this is like, what we have here is public resources, right? Public land, public resources that was the Norton Air Force Base being handed over to local planning agencies, and through things like the Joint Powers Authority, right? That's now runs the San Bernardino International Airport. But essentially, they're public resources that are being handed over to private industry. And so the question becomes, what is the public getting out of that, right? We should see what's happening on these military bases as a major transfer of wealth and resources to benefit private sector industries. And here we know that Amazon is benefiting substantially from the infrastructure that was already in place, but also new infrastructure and also the land that is there. And the question is, what does that mean for the local communities? How does the public actually benefit? The argument is that, hey, that this is going to benefit the public and the local communities because it's going to provide jobs. But the real question then becomes, how many jobs? What kinds of jobs are they? Are they paying good, decent wages? Who's getting
Hmm.
those jobs? Uh, but more importantly, what does that mean in terms of the ecological consequences through environmental damage that's also being caused because of the expansion of this industry in those communities? How are we
Hmm.
making sure that those communities are protected from what is taking place on in these facilities? So it's not just that, it's not just or Norton and San Bernardino, it's also March in Riverside, and then in the high desert there's another one that's being
Hmm.
transformed. And so that's a big question for me, and that's what I'm in the process of researching now and working on
Hmm.
in terms of a next book project. And I'm also doing a book on the Coachella Valley because that's where I'm from. That, you know, as you may know, the Coachella Valley, there's been a lot of conversation of the expansion of the warehousing industry along the I-10 corridor into
Hmm.
places like Palm Springs. And we've already seen some pretty significant size warehouses being built out in the desert as more and more expansion takes place. You know, it used to be that Moreno Valley used to be the edge of development, and now we're going far past that into places like Banning and places like the Coachella Valley to
Hmm.
service the major logistics industry that exists in Southern California. Anyway,
Hmm.
that's a long
Yeah.
introduction of myself, but
Yes.
that's who I am and why I'm interested in what I'm interested in.
Yeah. So I think just a few things to just kind of pick up from what you said. So you're saying that these private companies are using public resources, so like the bases as well as things that were already in place. So they're transporting from the port of LA, right? And the way that they get to these outside places are through like the freeways that were already there. That's another main issue that I think a lot of people have when they think about warehousing is just that the quality of their life has kind of declined because of these things like increased traffic and therefore increased pollution and therefore increased health concerns as affected by the pollution that's coming out of these truck routes. So as you were mentioning that they're using these public resources, have you found in your research that any of these private companies have been like improving these things or expanding these things at all, or is it just not part of their like MO to be, um, mitigating the effects of the things that they're causing?
Well, the sad fact is that unless they're compelled to do so, that the easy way will always be what's the cheapest way to do business, right?
Hmm.
And so what, and this is very clear when we look at cases like the mandates that have been implemented to clean up the environmental consequences of logistics. Why is it that we now have policies in the ports of LA and Long Beach to electrify some of the trucks that are delivering that cargo? That took place because community groups, environmental justice organizations sued repeatedly the ports to compel them to make sure that they weren't killing people by releasing toxic pollution in the form of PM 2.5, which is the particles that are released in diesel pollution. Um, and so we have, and in San Bernardino, the same issue has happened with the BNSF facility that's right in the middle of downtown San Bernardino. What this, you know, communities and residents have pushed hard for that facility to be cleaned. The state actually and BNSF was forced to do a study to look at its facilities. And what was found is that that particular facility in San Bernardino and the BNSF rail yard essentially is a really important site where you have, you know, essentially trains that are being loaded with truck containers, shipping containers that have been assembled in the local warehouses, and then they're put onto trains, and then those trains are sent out either to Dallas or to Chicago or to Utah to service those markets. What we found out is through various studies is that that BNSF facility had the highest rate of pollution of any of their facilities that they operated. Why
Wow.
was that? Because there was very little that was being done to monitor that, because operations expanded greatly with the expansion of the warehouse industry, and because the regulations were not in place in order for the local communities to be protected from those kinds of things. So on and on down the line, what we see is that companies will clean up their act if they are compelled to do so by laws or policy decisions. And what we also know is that communities and environmental justice organizations have been the ones who have put the pressure in order for the politicians to make policies and laws that protect those communities. It hasn't always been out of the benevolent heart of corporations or policymakers. It's because people have fought and struggled in order to make sure that they're not being poisoned and killed because of the facilities that are being built and operated in their communities, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. I mean, and the thing about the BNSF in downtown San Bernardino is pretty eye-opening. I mean, it just goes to show that that these companies are going to look at the easiest and cheapest way to do business, and the way that they're going to get around it is by doing it in communities that don't have that government protection, that don't have the local council members or like the local government mayor even like aware or have like the resources to actually implement these things to protect their residents.
Yeah,
I
and
think
it's
go
shocking. Oh, go ahead. It's shocking because um, the Inland Empire. What is it? The Inland Valley. What is the paper?
the development board. Oh no, the Inland Valley the Bulletin newspaper.
Yeah, the Daily Bulletin, right?
Mhm.
Um, they published graphs that show a cancer hub. And essentially, if you look at the graphs that have been published, it's not like politicians haven't been aware of this stuff, right?
Mhm.
But they've published charts that show this is the diesel death zone. And as you mentioned before about how communities have been dealing with the expansion of these warehouses, the big problem has been that as more and more warehouses has been built, what that has meant is more and more diesel pollution because of the machines or the trains that lift, the machines that lift the cranes off of the trains, they operate on diesel fuel. The trains operate on diesel fuel, and then the trucks that deliver the containers. Now, the problem is that as that expands and grows, as you've said, it grows into more and more communities of color and poor and working class communities. Um, the problem with diesel is that it's deadlier as it gets closer to you, meaning it's a point source pollutant. So if you are living closer to the point of pollution, that greatly increases your chance of getting cancer because of that pollution, right? So the fact that the expansion has taken place in primarily communities of color, whether that's Latina and Latino communities or is that Black communities, or working class communities in those areas, those are the same communities because the development has taken place in those areas. Those are communities that are not only working in those facilities that get that exposure, but then many of these plants are close to schools. And we
Mhm.
know that young bodies and developing bodies are even more prone to being vulnerable to those things. And those trucks are going up and down the community streets, sometimes idling, parking for a long time in the neighborhoods because there are no anti-truck idling laws that have been implemented. And so all of those forces together means that you're getting more exposure closer to where you're at, meaning that you're more in danger of being affected in terms of your health because of that diesel pollution. So
Hmm.
all of those factors have concentrated and have elevated the danger that is caused by this industry and the expansion that is taking place in this industry in the Inland Empire.
Yeah, and I think there's some good examples of that right now too in Bloomington, with the Zimmerman Elementary School that, is getting torn down, and they're trying to move it because it's too close to our house, because it's close to these like idling places. They're closing the school to make room for another warehouse, right? Like the just the examples that we see in the region, like just politicians and planners putting these kind of government corporations and interests over the needs of the residents and the children who live there, like their education, their socialization time is being like literally picked up and moved because they want to sell the land
Yeah.
to warehouse developers. So I mean, it's just there's so many examples too.
Yeah. No, but that's been going on for a while because um, if you need to build a new school, you need a large parcel of land, right?
Hmm.
And any large parcel of land that's available, it's also a target for new warehouse development. So oftentimes there's this fight between schools and warehouses, and sometimes some school districts, I know that this happened in Moreno Valley, were dealing with the fact that they were going to build a new school, and they knew that that land adjacent to it was going to be eventually a space for a warehouse. And so this kind of issue has happened over and
Wow.
over again because of what you said, that the population has grown so much that the number of schools or the school classes that are required has also gone up, right? Uh,
Hmm.
and when you build huge new tracts of housing development, you also have to make sure that that you're going to be able to meet the educational needs
Hmm.
of those houses. And so you're building houses in those areas that are also prime real estate for future expansion of warehouses. Right?
Wow. So it's kind of like this chase, right? That like there's land available and people want it for schools or housing blocks or things like that. But at the same time that the people who are living there, like the residents, see that land that warehouses are coming in and also scoping it out and seeing like where they can expand next because the demand is increasing for them too.
Right.
Yeah. I want to go back to your book a little bit. So you use the term politics of conversion and the political economy. Can you describe that in like just kind of more simpler terms, just in a way that we could kind of share for the listeners?
Yeah, I mean, part of what I kind of hinted at the what I meant a little bit by the politics conversion, um, by thinking about the conversion of these military bases into logistics hubs. And in order to understand that, and here's where it might get a little geeky, but it's important to understand this
Hmm.
connection, right?
Yeah.
Um, this process of converting Norton Air Force Base into the San Bernardino International Airport started years ago with what was known as the base realignment and closure process that was started in 1988 and continued. There were various rounds: 1988, 1991,
Hmm.
95, 2005. Essentially led to 17 military bases being closed in the first round, and then 28 in the second round, and then 32. So it's a lot of military bases that were closed during
Hmm.
that. Why? Because it was the end of the Cold War. Because the US government decided that it was no longer needed the kind of military in order to fight the old Soviet Union, and that it was going to modernize its military. Part of modernizing its military was doing away with many of these bases that were in existence precisely to fight the Cold War. And so, with that, we need to understand again, sometimes we think about the Inland Empire and we don't make connections to it's not just about the Inland Empire. And in fact, the region has played a really, really important role in the US economy, and in this particular case, the US military. So, this is going on, but what does that mean? It means that military bases need to be thought of as public assets, right? They are public resources that are there. Um, and we need to think about them, and what's been going on is because when the military base is closed, oftentimes they were giving over to local agencies, local cities, through these things called joint powers authorities. And that essentially meant that they were transferring responsibility from the federal government to the local government. Okay. And so all of these local governments then started to have responsibility over these large parcels of land, right? And they needed to decide what they were going to do with it. Now, it just so happens that in Riverside and San Bernardino counties, that the obvious choice for these politicians was, let's make them into logistics hubs. Now, in other parts of the country, these military bases that were closed were turned around and used for affordable housing development, or they were turned around and used for education needs, or they were turned around and used for park space and open space and green space, right? So we have other examples of how these military bases, how the local governments that were then responsible for them used them to improve the daily life of the residents in those neighborhoods. That did not happen in Riverside and San Bernardino counties. Instead of pursuing those other routes, the decision was, let's make them into logistics hubs. So when I talk about the politics of conversion, what I mean is, like, how did that happen? How did we get to the point where it was decided that the best interest and the best use of these public resources, again, that means that it's owned by the public. It's not a private interest. It's not privately owned. That these are publicly owned. That means you and me, if you're a resident of the Inland Empire, should have an interest and a say in what's happening in those facilities, in those sites. But the decision was made to convert them into military bases. And my question around the politics of conversion is, like, okay, who's really benefiting from this conversion process, right? Who is benefiting from this conversion into these facilities? And again, the same as I was talking about earlier, the conversation always goes back to, we're improving the public, the local economy, and that ultimately is going to improve the life of the general public. My real question and response to that is, which public are you talking about? Who is involved in that definition of the public? Because what we know is that if you're not paying attention and you don't prioritize the local communities that are in those facilities or living near those facilities, that they, for the most part, will be hurt more than they are helped by many of the things I have already talked about today: pollution, low wage jobs, etc. Right? And so that's what I think we need to go back to, because there's an assumption. We're in this period where, like, well, that's what it should be. My questioning is, like, why should it be this way? And who is going to benefit? And how do we make sure that we create a process of decision making where the communities that are being the most affected also have their interests protected and looked after? And you talked a little about earlier about the political foundation, the political base. What we know is that the Inland Empire, and I talk about this in my first book, is very interesting and troublesome, because so much of the political machinery and the political power has been controlled by very conservative politicians that don't always ask about the best interest of those communities we've been talking about. And so part of the organizing that has taken place has been organizing around political representation, right? Because people figured out early on that if you're fighting for the improvement of these communities, that if you go and you talk to the local politicians who have a different, more conservative political ideology, they're not necessarily going to be listening to you or care about what you have to say. So that meant having to change that political landscape in order to be able to have more effective arguments and political points, because then people would actually might invite you to the table to sit down and have that conversation, instead of closing the door in your face, which I think had happened for a very long time. That's
Yeah.
still in process. But even if you get more liberal politicians that are more friendly, there's still a huge challenge, because the question then becomes, what's the alternative? What do we do in order to get the kinds of tax revenues to provide the basic services that these communities also need, right?
Hmm.
And it's a real question about what is the economic model that should be used in order to improve the daily conditions of these communities. And that's, I think, where we're at in this process.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Um, I was just thinking too, like based off of like talking about the government and things like that. Um, these conversions of the military bases, like you said, that some of them were used as open spaces or green spaces or educational needs or fulfilling affordable housing needs. How like that, all of that is great, and it also costs money.
Mhm.
So I'm just thinking, like, were there any government subsidies that were used to fluff up or to support the conversion of these military bases? And were some of those government subsidies used in places like the Inland Empire?
Yes, a lot of government subsidies have been available for that kind of transformation, especially because many of these sites were also heavily polluted sites, which is also the case of San Bernardino International Airport. It's heavily polluted. In fact, it's so heavily polluted that that's one of the rationales or the reasons that is given for it not to be turned into affordable housing sites, because it's
Wow.
so polluted. And that speaks to, you ask a really important question, and I'm afraid to go down this road because it can be overly complicated, but I think it's necessary to think about the big picture here, right? You think about how much money the federal government invested in those military bases in order to make them um, function and operate during the Cold War period, right? So,
Hmm.
and the question becomes, okay, so you came into these facilities, into these areas, you spend billions of dollars to run these facilities. um, Many of these facilities are now poisoned, right, with underground plumes. um, shouldn't you clean it up, right? And shouldn't you
Hmm.
think about return, if you're really going to return this land and these resources to the local communities that have been there, right? Then maybe you should give it back to them in a condition that's actually usable by those communities. So we're
Hmm.
not. So then those communities are not asking you to do all this inordinate spending. It's just like, do something so that you can return this land and
Hmm.
these resources to those communities in a in
Hmm.
a in a state where they're actually usable and they're not poisonous to us, right? So
Hmm.
there's one way to think about the responsibility that the federal government has. It shouldn't just be up to the local communities to find money in order to make these places available for clean, more community-based development, right? So that's
Hmm.
one way to think about it. Um, the other way is that there are federal dollars that are available to clean up what are known as Superfund sites, right? Sites that are so polluted that essentially require, dirt to be dug up and trucked away and put into containers so that they don't release the toxins and the pollution to poison people. Um, this, the reality is that in these facilities, the decision was made, it will cost much more to clean up this facility, that so that they could then be used for other goods. So the best thing is, the more cost effective thing is to just make them into commercial centers, which means turn them into logistics hubs. So the decision was very specifically made to not invest in those communities for that particular purpose. Okay.
Hmm.
So when we're talking about subsidies, that's an issue, right? Because it's already been decided that it's not worth it to clean up those spaces so that they can actually be habitable and lived on
Hmm.
by these communities. Now, are there funds available? Yeah, I mean, so many funds that are available in terms of environmental mitigation, toxic cleanup, um, green space development. The federal government right now is doing a lot to deal with environmental justice issues and around infrastructure spending, and to make sure that, all the money that's being invested in things like the Green New Deal, or, or elements of the Green New Deal, aren't reproducing environmental inequities. So the funding is available, but it has been the larger vision and the political will that has been missing from these conversations, because frankly, they haven't been pursued with any kind of seriousness, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the money that is being used to expand the airport, to make it into a logistics hub, it's all publicly subsidized or supported through public subsidies, because it's a publicly operated facility, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so those monies, we can think about them as, okay, the decision was made to support this industry and not to support any kind of vision that the community might have about that space, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a long-winded way of saying it. Really, one, the discussion has been really short about other ways to use that space and what needs to happen and where we can get the resources and the funding in order to do that. And then two, the focus from the beginning has been, how do we make this into a logistics hub?
Mm-hmm.
So that was very clear about the politics, and the political agenda has always been, we're going to make this into a logistics hub.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of reasons why that happened, right? And one of them happens to be, if you look at the marketing materials and the planning materials, one of the things that it says very clearly in there is that Norton used to have, and the airport now has, the longest runway in Southern
Oh.
California. Okay. When they built that facility, they had to build a long runway. Why did they
Mm-hmm.
have to build a long runway? Because it so happened that Norton, when it was still a military base, was the home of the Ballistic Missile Organization and the San Bernardino Air Materiel Area. It used to be the home of the Atlas and the Titan I ballistic missile program, which was, the military's nuclear weapons, right? And so even back then, Norton was a logistics hub, but it was a
Mm-hmm.
military logistics hub,
Mm-hmm.
and it needed to support all of these big missiles. And what did you need to do that? You needed a long, long runway to
Yeah.
support all the planes that were bringing in all this stuff. And so when they were touting it and when they were marketing it to companies, hey, they said one of the benefits is it has easy access to rail lines, it has easy access to truck routes and the highway off ramps, and it has easy access, and it has the longest runway. So when they were marketing it and saying to companies like Amazon, come set up your shop here, that's what they were using. They were using
Mm-hmm.
the benefits of all of the public investment that had gone into making the airport
Mm-hmm.
into a Cold War logistics hub. And so it made sense for them then to turn around and saying, now we're going to make it into a commercial logistics hub.
Mm-hmm. Wow. No, I didn't know that it had the longest runway.
Oh, yeah.
That's Yeah, I mean it's good to know the history of everything too. And talking about what the Air Force Base now, which is the Amazon KSBD, like just kind of backtracking a little bit, like why was Amazon and other logistics companies looking at purchasing bases, right? Like, is it because the demand for things like 2-day and same day shipping has increased and they're trying to keep up with competitors, or they were just looking to expand and get more land that's close to railways, that has these kinds of access to freeways like the 60 and the 10, things like that? Or is it just a combination of everything?
Both, but I think the important thing is to, if you look at Amazon's building, like expansion of its network, it's doing a lot of different kinds of logistics spaces, right? So it has the big
Mm-hmm.
facilities that we know. One of them exists at the airport there, but it also has a lot of last mile facilities, like small processing facilities, right? Um, and so it's doing both. It's building smaller facilities to do last mile deliveries and returns, and then it has these big facilities where stuff is coming in from the ports and then being reassembled and then being shipped off to other freight centers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Amazon announced in 2020 that it was going to build a new Western freight hub. So it's not just a warehouse. I mean, they call it a Western freight hub. And it was going to build that Western freight hub in order to tie it into its existing network of freight hubs. I was mentioning
Mm-hmm.
that they're building all these other things. So more specifically, the freight hub in San Bernardino is tied in directly to some of the stuff that they've also been doing, things like in Cincinnati in northern Kentucky, they have an airport freight there. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's part of that larger system, right? So they needed to have a big facility because they were going to build this network freight hub across the country in other parts, and San Bernardino fits into that bigger network.
Mm-hmm.
Around that bigger network of freight hubs are all these smaller warehouses that are located closer to markets, right?
Yeah.
So they all play a different role in the supply chain that Amazon has. But in order to expand, they needed an air freight hub. And where were you going to build an air freight hub in Southern California? Great opportunity to do that at the San Bernardino International Airport because of what I mentioned earlier was access to all of that infrastructure that was already in place, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't, you couldn't just build a whole new airport. It would cost a lot more for
Mm-hmm.
Amazon to build a whole new airport, right? Or to
Yeah.
get a contract with an existing commercial air freight hub, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it could have gone to Ontario Airport, but we know that Ontario is shifting. It's trying to move away from all that freight and more towards passenger, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
so go down the street to San Bernardino. They have an airport there. They have an airport that's in a really, really good space in terms of tying it into the rest of the infrastructure around logistics. And so that made perfect sense for the company because they didn't have to then invest in creating that infrastructure. So you talk about subsidy, that's a major subsidy, right? It's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, this exists, but it doesn't exist because the company invested anything in it. It exists because it's a public resource that now Amazon is,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. It's good to know and see the bigger picture that these are just parts. Like what's happening in San Bernardino is just part of the puzzle of the major like nationwide network that Amazon is planning, and it's happening in other cities too. Like you said, other places that are getting acquired, like these airports are getting acquired by Amazon so that they can connect these networks and ship things like across the country via the freight and air travel now that they have. Um, so it's good to hear about the history and like what it is now. But I think the final question that I just wanted to ask is just like looking towards the future, and people are organizing now and people are demanding more, and EJ groups are putting in lawsuits and things like that. All that is happening now. So in the future, like is there potential for transformation for places, for these different army bases and different like military bases and things that they could change into post logistics, right? Like what do you see kind of happening in the Inland Empire if we do ever, like if we manage to shift away from the logistics and transportation
Yeah,
companies?
we are beginning to see that. It's just that when I first started writing my first book, my goodness, it was like you would talk about community benefits agreements, and people were like, "What is that?" Right? So,
Yeah, yeah.
and so it took a long time. It took a long time for the conversation in the Inland Empire among policymakers to even begin to entertain the thought of something
Mm-hmm.
like a community benefits agreement. And we saw kind of the landmark case in the past couple of years where the first sort of case of that in Fontana, the discussions around community benefits agreements, et cetera, were taking hold and people were beginning to have that conversation. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Again, I think that came through years of struggle, all right? Years of struggle through CCAEJ, Community Collective for Environmental Justice,
Mm-hmm.
the Warehouse Workers Resource Center,
Mm-hmm.
all of those organizations that have been fighting around this issue for years and years and years finally have sort of gained some traction, right? one of the things that's been really, really important is that you started to see within the past 5 to 10 years a regional network of organizations working together on these issues. Because for a
Mm-hmm.
long time, it was really like the model of organizing around there was like it was a site fight, what's known as a site
Mm-hmm.
fight, right? Like one facility was going in, let's fight that one and let's organize to try to keep that one on. And then the next one would happen and the next one happened. And I think people finally realized at some point that really to deal with this issue, you have to organize at a regional level and you have to build alliances and networks because it's not just about individual facilities that are going on, but it's a larger trend within the region. So I think, for future, what has to happen and what is going on now, what people are doing now that I think will improve and will, I think, advance conversations around more sustainable development that is not just about um, uh, opening up every possible land available towards a warehouse, is a conversation about what the real issues are around building equitable development, right?
Mm-hmm.
What kinds of industries can actually be supported that will support people getting good jobs in industries that are not poisonous and causing a lot of pollution and damage to those local neighborhoods. We
Right.
are at a really early stage of all of that, as you know. I mean, you're in the middle of doing this work, right? It's in a really, really important moment in history. We finally see within the past 5 years the political landscape changing,
Mm-hmm.
where more and more progressive views about what the region can become, what the area should become, what responsible government means. All of that stuff is finally beginning to sort of percolate
Mm-hmm.
across the region, not just in one little hub or one little neighborhood, but more and more. There are more organizations, right? Like the one you're
Mm-hmm.
involved in.
Mm-hmm.
10 years ago, didn't exist, right?
Yeah.
Um, or they existed, but in little isolated areas. But
Mm-hmm.
people are coming together, and a lot of it has had to do with the work that a lot of the organizations that are there have been working on. We know that, for example, for a long time, the Inland Empire has been underfunded. We know that foundations, only until very recently,
Mm-hmm.
have not supported progressive grassroots-based organizing. The
Mm-hmm.
historical model has been to support charity. And charity and other nonprofits that are not doing base building and building community power. And I think
Mm-hmm.
we're seeing now more organizations focusing on base building, collective organizing for community power, and really talking about social and economic and ecological justice. Um, like that is such an important point of how whatever solution is going to come, because I don't pretend to have an answer for that question, but what I
Mm-hmm.
know is if we're going to get anywhere close to an answer to your question about what the future holds and what are some potential breakthroughs and improvements, if we're going to get to that point, then we need to continue to do the work that's being done by people like you and other folks that you're working with to support community power building, right? Because as I've said, so much of this is because of the lack of political will to do the right thing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's only going to be when communities have enough power to compel, meaning to drag them kicking and screaming, right? If they need to make the
Yeah.
right choice, that improvements will come. And that's how we see change happen, right? Over and over.
Yes.
Yeah, the politicians might get up there and and take credit for the laws they passed. But we know that the laws were passed because people were up in their offices, knocking on their doors, doing sit-ins in the offices,
Mm-hmm.
out there getting out the vote to make sure specific people are elected. That's why they listen. That's why they do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's going to take more of that work in order for us to get, to where we need to get to. But what I can say is there has been a lot of improvement. There has been a lot of
Mm-hmm.
progress and a lot of change. I've seen it with my own eyes since somebody who's been working in that area since the early 1990s, right?
Hmm.
I can appreciate that. Would I like it to be faster? Would I like more to be changed?
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. But things are moving, things are improving, and all we can do is to continue to support that by whatever work, right? Researching the
Hmm.
kind of environmental justice, this kind of public media outreach, right? Conversations,
Hmm.
um, because we need more and more people to have conversations like this about, what are the optimal futures that we should try to work together to build.
Hmm.
How do we improve these communities? How do we make sure that these things pass, and how do we make sure that these industries are not killing us and then turning around and giving us low wage jobs, and then, on the other hand, submitting us to backbreaking work, right?
Hmm.
So on many different levels, I think that's why it's the kind of the collaboration among organizations is key, because it's not just one issue. It's not just an environmental issue.
Hmm.
It's not just a labor
Hmm.
issue. It's not just an immigrants issue, right? It's not just a racial
Hmm.
justice issue. It's all of these things coming together, how they intersect, that we need to think about solutions to these problems.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you for the history lesson on everything.
Done?
And yeah, yeah. I mean, if you wanted to keep going, we could.
I went by really fast.
Yeah, I know. When you start talking about something that you're really passionate about, it's like time just flies. But you
Yeah.
know, I appreciate the history lesson. I hope that some of the people that are listening got to learn something new about the history of these like military bases and how they're being used and things like that, and hopefully inspire people to keep fighting the fight and keep working on what they're working on to make the community a better place, despite like the history and all of the politicians making these decisions on behalf of people, right? That people are still inspired to um, get out there and do their organizing with the community, whether that be in their faith-based organizations or other organizing places like WWRC or the Immigrant Coalition for the Coalition for Immigrant Justice or things like that as well. So thank you so much for like the overall holistic lesson on everything. And if you want to just briefly just plug in your new book, when it would come out and things like that, so we could just conclude.
Good question. That's a good question. And thank you for having me. First of all, I don't know when the book will come out. I'm working on it, and these things sometimes take longer than
Yeah.
anticipated. I did want to just say one quick thing is like, one of the things that I hope people pay attention to, and people are not fooled by, is all of the conversation around building green supply chains, right? And
Hmm.
is a form of, I think, sometimes um, greenwashing the
Hmm.
logistics industry, where the solution often turns to things like, oh, we're putting solar panels on the rooftops of these warehouses, as if
Yeah.
that's going to resolve the issue. And we know that, in fact, that doesn't resolve the issue. One of the things that I will plug and encourage people to look at, is, how do we keep how do we keep making the case why these things are so important, the issues that we're talking about, not only important but really critical, and lives depend on this stuff, right? For
Hmm.
example, in 2006, when the ports of Long Beach and LA decided that they were going to electrify their diesel trucks, there was they did a study, they did their own study that found that um, the ports created health risks for more than 2 million residents. Okay, health risks for 2 million residents,
Wow.
and that they generated over $590 billion in annual medical expenses. Okay, so my question is, how do we know exactly how many people are at risk, just in the Inland Empire, because of these
Hmm.
and this is now almost 20 years later, right? Where is this information? Who's keeping track of this information? We don't keep track of it.
Hmm. Hmm.
uh, how many, medical bills and medical expenses are being produced and a lot of times being paid out of people's pockets because they're being harmed by this industry. And
Hmm.
one way to think about that is people who are being poisoned are subsidizing the logistics industry because they're paying the own cost of being harmed by this industry, right?
Hmm.
So my one of the things that I want to not just plug, but think get us to think, and more research has to be done, right? Still, sadly, not enough research is being done. Organizations like yours, the organizations that you mentioned, need to be supported. I'd rather plug those organizations that you mentioned because they're the ones that are doing this work, and that we need to support. So I encourage all of the listeners to be in touch. Hopefully, you can put up links, or you have links on
Hmm.
your website to the organizations that are working on these issues. Support those organizations. Get involved. If you live in those communities, these are your communities. Get involved. Join the struggle to make sure that our communities, your children, their children's children will grow up in a space that is less harmful and actually nourishes human life, as opposed to nourishes these industries that are killing people. So that's my plug for support
Yeah.
local grassroots organizations that are doing this work, because it's incredibly important. And thank you for inviting me to your podcast.